Have you ever been so tired that even the idea of resting felt like something you no longer deserved? Not physically tired. That kind you can sleep off, the other kind. The kind that settles in your chest and stays. That's exactly where this story begins. The MARTA Gold Line smelled like every Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta. Someone's lunch in a paper bag, the metallic bite of recycled air, and the specific stillness of a city that had been running since dawn and hadn't stopped yet. Margaret Calloway sat with her laptop balanced on her knees, her reading glasses pushed up on her nose, scrolling through her own resume for the 9th time that week. 22 years in supply chain management, 6 Sigma certified, fluent in SAP and Oracle systems. Available immediately. Available immediately. She read it again and felt the quiet shame those 2 words carried. At 50, they sounded less like a selling point and more like a confession that the last 4 months of retirement had unraveled faster than she'd expected, that the pension didn't stretch as far as the financial advisor had promised, that the version of herself she'd planned to become in this chapter simply hadn't shown up yet. Her son Derek had said, over Sunday dinner, with the careful tone of someone choosing words like they're stepping around broken glass, "Mom, you could stay with us for a while, just until things settle." And she had smiled, passed the cornbread, and changed the subject. Staying with Derek meant folding herself into the edges of his life, becoming background furniture in a house where she'd always felt mildly tolerated rather than truly welcome. That wasn't an option. It had never been. Margaret didn't notice the exact moment her eyes closed. The night before had ended at 2 a.m, not because she'd finished anything, but because her body had simply refused to keep going. She'd spent hours adjusting margins, changing fonts, rewriting her summary statement as if the problem were the formatting and not the fear underneath it. The rhythmic sway of the train, the hum of the air system, and 3 weeks of poor sleep conspired without warning. Her head dropped. Slowly at first, the way exhaustion falls, not all at once, but in stages, like someone who keeps catching themselves and then finally stops trying, and it landed. On the other side of that landing was Zara Cole, 25 years old, founder and CEO of Meridian Labs, a supply chain intelligence company valued at just over $1 billion. She'd built it in 4 years out of a converted garage in Decatur. She rode MARTA twice a week because she'd grown up on it, and she believed that the moment you stopped using the same infrastructure as the people your company served, you started making decisions that hurt them. So she kept writing. She sat with her earbuds in and no music playing, which was her way of having privacy without asking for it. When the woman beside her head tipped and came to rest on her shoulder, Zara went very still. She looked over slowly, took in the reading glasses, the slightly open mouth, the hands gone slack around the laptop, and the document filling the screen. She hadn't meant to read it, but the font was large, and the screen was bright, and the words were right there. Margaret A. Calloway, Senior Supply Chain Director, Operations Lead, Hargrove Logistics, 2002-2024. Zara pulled one earbud out. She kept reading. The resume was dense with real experience, not the kind you build in classrooms or polish in workshops, but the kind that comes from being the person in the room when everything goes wrong and staying anyway. There was a line about redesigning the Southeastern distribution network during a 6-week supply disruption in 2021 that made Zara's jaw tighten, not with skepticism, but with recognition. Her own company had nearly fractured during that same period. She'd lost 2 major contracts because she hadn't had someone in that room. This woman had held that room together for 22 years, and now she was asleep on a MARTA train with her glasses crooked and her laptop sliding and her resume open like an unanswered question. Zara didn't move. She'd think about this moment later, try to find the right word for it, and keep coming up short. It wasn't pity. It wasn't strategy. It was something quieter than both. Something that made moving feel wrong in a way she couldn't explain to herself yet. The train slid through Lindbergh Center, through Art Center, through Midtown. When the automated voice announced Peachtree Center, Margaret startled awake the way people do when they don't know, for just a second, where they are. Her eyes went to the laptop, then to the window, then to the young woman beside her, and the heat of embarrassment hit her face all at once. "Oh God, She pulled upright, catching the laptop before it slid. "I am so sorry. That has never happened to me, not once. I'm so sorry. Zara didn't rush to respond. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, pulled out a card, and held it between two fingers before extending it across the space between them. I read your resume, she said. Not apologetically, just plainly. I've been looking for someone with exactly that background for longer than I'd like to admit. A beat. But I'm also just curious about the person. Margaret looked at the card the way you look at something you're not sure is real. You read my resume while I was sleeping. It was open. On my laptop. You were using my shoulder. Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Then, without deciding to, she let out a sound that was almost a laugh. Short, disbelieving, a little worn around the edges. All right, she said, taking the card. I've never been recruited in my sleep before. First time for everything, I suppose. The train stopped at Peachtree Center. Margaret stood, pressed her bag to her side, and walked to the door. Before stepping out, she turned once. Zara was still watching her. Tell me, have you ever had a moment arrive completely sideways? Not the one you planned, not the one you were ready for, just something small and ordinary that somehow landed in exactly the right place. Sometimes the things that matter most don't announce themselves. They just show up. If this story is already pulling at something in you, subscribe and turn on notifications. What's coming in the next chapter changes everything. There's a particular kind of courage it takes to walk into an interview at 50. You're not just carrying your resume, you're carrying every year behind it. Every decision, every sacrifice, every version of yourself you had to set aside to keep moving. And underneath all of that, if you're honest, there's always the question you never say out loud. Am I still enough? Meridian Labs occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Peachtree Street, NE, understated from the outside, open and deliberately human on the inside. No mahogany walls, no intimidating lobbies designed to make visitors feel small. Instead, exposed brick, large windows, whiteboards covered in working diagrams, a kitchen where people actually ate lunch together at a long communal table. Margaret arrived 12 minutes early and stood in the lobby taking it in with the practiced eye of someone who has assessed a lot of organizations from the inside out. A young man named Jordan checked her in and walked her to a corner meeting room she hadn't expected. 2 chairs angled toward each other, a low table with coffee, a window looking out over the city, no desk between them, no performative power arrangement. Zara arrived exactly on time, no assistant trailing her, phone in her jacket pocket instead of her hand. She'd changed from the night before, dark slacks, a burgundy turtleneck, the same quiet directness in everything she wore. She sat without ceremony. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for the invitation, Margaret said, with the posture of someone who has done this hundreds of times and means it every time. For the first 20 minutes, it was a clean, well-run interview. Zara asked technical questions that revealed she understood exactly what she was asking about. Margaret answered with the precision of someone who had lived the work rather than studied it, without exaggerating and without minimizing. They moved through systems, timelines, crisis management frameworks, vendor negotiation strategy. Then Zara asked about 2020, and something in the temperature of the room shifted. Walk me through how you managed your team during the disruption, not operationally, personally. Human to human. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I did what my grandmother would have done, she said finally. I called everyone. Not a group text, not an email blast. Individual calls. I asked how their families were doing, whether they had enough, whether anyone needed help getting groceries, whether their kids' schools had closed, whether they were scared. I listened to all of it before we talked about a single shipment. Zara held her gaze. How many people on your team? 41. You called 41 people individually. Every week. For 5 months. The silence between them was comfortable, in a way that most silences in interview rooms are not. 41 calls. Every week. For 5 months. Think about that. Not because anyone required it, not because it was in any job description, but because she understood that people work inside their lives, not separate from them. That's not management training. That's character. And character like that doesn't show up on any resume. It only shows up in moments like this one. "Why did you leave Hargrove?" Zara asked. "I retired." A pause. "I thought it was time." "And was it?" Margaret looked at the coffee she hadn't touched yet. "No," she said. The word came out quieter than she'd intended. More honest than she'd planned to be with someone she'd just met. "I learned that too late." Zara didn't offer a response to that. She just tilted her head slightly, the gesture of someone who is filing something away without a sound. Near the end of the meeting, after they'd discussed structure, scope, and a consulting arrangement that would give Margaret autonomy without locking her into a rigid schedule, Zara asked something that sat completely outside the register of everything before it. "Do you actually drink coffee, or do you just hold the cup?" Margaret glanced at the untouched mug, then at Zara. "Depends on the coffee. This one's from a small roaster in Reynoldstown, worth trying." Margaret picked it up and took a sip. It was, in fact, excellent. "All right," she said, "I drink it." Zara smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled since she'd walked in, and Margaret registered it with a sharpness that surprised her. She left the building with a consulting agreement in her email, and something she couldn't name sitting quietly in her chest. She stood on Peachtree Street for a moment, the city moving around her, afternoon light cutting long and gold between the buildings, and tried to identify it. Curious about the person, Zara had said on the train. Margaret had assumed it was a professional courtesy, a polished thing people say. Standing on the sidewalk, she wasn't so sure anymore. There's a difference between someone who asks questions to fill space and someone who asks because they genuinely want to know the answer. Margaret had spent 22 years in rooms full of the first kind. She recognized the second kind immediately. That's what made it complicated. That evening, her daughter Renee called from Nashville to check in. "So? How'd it go?" "Well, I think." She offered me a consulting contract. "She? The CEO is a woman?" "Yes." "Young?" Margaret paused a half-second longer than she needed to. "Younger than me." "What's she like?" Margaret looked out the window at the neighborhood settling into evening, the streetlights coming on one by one down her block in Kirkwood. "Direct," she said, "very direct." Renee laughed. "Sounds like someone I know." Margaret said goodnight and sat for a long time in the quiet of her house, not reading, not working, just sitting with the particular feeling of a day that had rearranged something inside her without asking permission first. Don't miss what's building here. Subscribe and share this story with someone who needs it today. There's a before and an after in every connection that matters. The before is when you're still performing, still editing yourself in real time, still deciding how much to let show. The after is when you stop, when you just appear. This chapter is about the moment the shift happens. The first 3 weeks at Meridian moved at a pace Margaret recognized and welcomed. Assessments, gap analyses, vendor audits, operational reviews. She arrived early most days, stayed as long as the work required, and made a point of learning every name in the office before the end of the first week. Her experience fit into the company's structure with the particular ease of something that had been missing, without anyone knowing exactly what shape the absence was. With Zara, the working relationship was efficient and respectful. Weekly check-ins, direct communication about priorities, occasional quick calls when something needed an immediate decision. Zara didn't micromanage and didn't disappear. She was precisely present in the ways that mattered. Margaret appreciated that more than she said. It was a Thursday evening when Zara appeared in the doorway of the small office Margaret had been using, coat already on. "There's a place 3 blocks from here that does really good Southern food. The kind your grandmother made, not the kind restaurants pretend to make." She paused. "If you don't have somewhere to be." Margaret saved her file. "I don't." The restaurant was called Lola's Table. Cash only, red checkered tablecloths, a chalkboard menu that changed daily, and a line out the door that moved faster than it looked. They got a corner booth and ordered without deliberating. Fried catfish, collards, cornbread, sweet tea. The kind of meal that doesn't allow for pretense. They talked about work for the first 10 minutes. Then, somewhere between the cornbread and the main course, they didn't anymore. Zara talked about growing up in Decatur, the daughter of a high school principal and an electrician who worked double shifts so she could go to Georgia Tech without loans. About how she'd slept in the office more nights than not in the first year of Meridian because she couldn't afford both a lease and payroll. About how she still hadn't figured out how to slow down, how every time she tried, it felt less like rest and more like falling. Margaret talked about raising 2 kids alone after her marriage ended when she was 34, about learning logistics from the ground up, working every shift available until she understood the whole system from warehouse floor to executive table, about how Hargrove had been, for a long time, the most stable thing in her life, more consistent than most of her relationships, more honest than most of her friendships. And outside of work? Zara asked. Outside of work was managed chaos, Margaret said, with the tone of someone who has made peace with a hard thing. But it was my chaos. I knew how to run it. Zara looked at her with that particular focused attention Margaret had started to recognize, steady, unhurried, like she was listening for something beneath the words as well as in them. Do you have anyone in your life who listens like that? Not waiting for you to finish so they can respond. Actually listening. Taking you in. It's rarer than it should be. And when you're not used to it, when you've spent years being competent and capable and largely invisible as a person, someone paying that kind of attention can feel almost alarming. You never remarried after the divorce? Zara asked. The question landed without weight, carried in the same direct register as every other question Zara asked. Margaret didn't feel the need to sidestep it. No, there were opportunities, but nothing ever fit. I stopped expecting it to. You or me? Margaret asked. Me. Short relationships. Nothing that survived long enough to matter. The company took everything I had for a long time. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact she'd already processed. I told myself I'd made peace with that. Maybe you just haven't found the right fit yet, Margaret said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things do when you're relaxed and a little off your guard, and she heard it a half second after it left her mouth, with a clarity that made her reach for her sweet tea. Zara looked at her, held the look a beat longer than was strictly conversational. Margaret changed the subject, asked about the quarterly vendor review. The moment passed, but on the drive home through Inman Park, with the Atlanta skyline lit up in the rearview mirror, she didn't turn on the radio. She let the silence stay, let the thought she'd been organizing around for 2 weeks take up a little more room than she usually allowed. If this chapter stopped you, share this video. Someone in your life needs to hear that it's not too late. It was too late for this kind of thing. She'd decided that a long time ago. It was complicated. It was unlikely. It was the sort of thing that happened to other people in other circumstances. Not to a 50-year-old woman from Kirkwood who'd been practical her entire adult life out of necessity and then out of habit. But the thought didn't leave. It settled into a corner of her chest, quiet and patient, the way things stay when they're not ready to be dismissed. There's a specific kind of self-deception we're all capable of. We let something grow for weeks, tend to it quietly, protect it from the light, and then tell ourselves it isn't there. We rearrange our whole inner life around it, while insisting there's nothing to rearrange. We do this because naming it makes it real, and real things require a response. And sometimes we're not ready for what that response might cost us. It was Renee who noticed first. She'd come up from Nashville for a long weekend, the kind of visit that involved cooking together and watching old movies, and not having to explain anything. Saturday morning, they were at Margaret's kitchen table with coffee and the remains of breakfast when Margaret mentioned work. Then mentioned it again. Then mentioned Zara's read on a vendor problem they'd solved that week. The way she'd asked exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. Renee wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at her mother with the patient expression she'd inherited, apparently directly from her. What's she like? Sharp, Margaret said immediately. Unusually sharp and fair. She doesn't manage through ego. You've told me that part. I mean, what's she like? Margaret looked at her coffee. She's direct, focused, more emotionally aware than most people half her... She stopped. Half her age? Renee said gently. more aware than most people I've worked with. Renee was quiet for a moment, then, "Mom, how old is she?" 25. Renee nodded, said nothing, drank her coffee. The silence between them was the kind that had its own language, built over years, calibrated by a mother and daughter who both knew when a thing was too real to push it directly and too real to leave alone entirely. Renee had learned, from watching Margaret, that the right response to a moment like this was patience, so she offered it. Margaret was grateful for it and said nothing. Mothers and daughters develop a private language over years, one built from the things left unsaid as much as the things spoken. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone sit with what they've almost said without making them say it before they're ready. 2 weeks later, Zara asked Margaret to join her for a site visit at a distribution facility in College Park. Professionally, it made complete sense. Margaret knew distribution infrastructure the way she knew her own neighborhood. But walking through that facility with Zara was different from any working visit she could remember. There was something in showing someone a world you know completely, pointing to a cross-docking setup and explaining why it was inefficient. Watching Zara's eyes move to the exact bottleneck before Margaret had finished describing it. The questions Zara asked weren't testing, they were building. She was genuinely thinking alongside her, not evaluating her. Margaret hadn't worked like that with anyone in years. On the drive back, Zara's assistant was in the front with the driver, and they were in the back with space between them, and the Atlanta late afternoon sliding past the windows. "Can I ask you something?" Zara said. "Of course. Why do you still take MARTA?" A pause. "You live in Kirkwood. The office is Midtown. It's not the most efficient route." Margaret looked at the window. "I like it," she said. "Did you like it before?" A silence that lasted exactly long enough to be honest. "Less," she said. Zara turned to look at her. Didn't say anything for a moment, just looked. The way she did when she was giving something the full weight of her attention. Then she turned back to the window. Margaret felt the shape of that silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that doesn't let you pretend you don't understand what's being said without words. The kind that asks you, quietly but clearly, to stop running from what you already know. If this moment hit different, like it's about something bigger than just these two people, that's because it is. Share this video and subscribe. The last chapter is the one that stays with you. Here's what I want you to sit with. The hardest conversation isn't always the one you have with another person. Sometimes it's the one you keep refusing to have with yourself. Margaret had been having that conversation for weeks. She just hadn't let it reach the surface yet. That night, Margaret sat on her back porch in Kirkwood. The neighborhood was doing what it did at 9 on a weeknight. Dogs being walked, someone's television murmuring through a window screen, the smell of jasmine from the yard next door that bloomed every spring without being asked. She was 50 years old. She had raised 2 children on her own, and done it without losing herself entirely. She had built a career that had meant something, had been the person other people steadied themselves against in the hard moments. She had survived the end of her marriage and the beginning of her solitude and the long, careful process of making peace with both. And now she was sitting on her porch, thinking about a 25-year-old woman who read resumes on public transit and held very still and asked questions that arrived somewhere the others didn't reach. Margaret knew the name of what she was feeling. She'd known it for a while. She just hadn't said it to herself yet in plain language. She said it now. Quietly, in the dark, just to herself, just to make it real. The jasmine kept blooming, the television kept murmuring, the neighborhood carried on entirely unbothered. She stayed on the porch until the air cooled and the street went still. Then she went inside and, for the first time in weeks, slept the whole night through. We've made it to the last chapter, and I want you to hold on to something before we get there. The most beautiful endings aren't the ones that arrive without effort. They're the ones that happen after someone decides, despite everything reasonable arguing against it, to try anyway. This is what that looks like. It was Margaret who moved first. Not with a speech, not with a declaration she'd rehearsed in the mirror. On a Monday morning, when Zara stopped by her office doorway on the way to a meeting and mentioned offhand that there was a new jazz quartet playing at Venkman's that Friday, Margaret looked up from her screen and said, before she'd decided to, "I'd like to go, if you're asking." Zara paused. Something crossed her face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet landing, the look of someone who had been hoping without letting themselves hope. "I'm asking," she said. That simple. Venkman's was in the old Fourth Ward. Warm, low-lit. The kind of place that felt like someone's living room had gotten very good at hospitality. The quartet was already playing when they arrived. Something slow and conversational in the way only live jazz manages. The kind of music that doesn't demand anything from you except presence. They found seats at a corner table. Ordered drinks without looking at the menu too long. Let the music fill the spaces that might otherwise have required filling. "Do you come here often?" Margaret asked, and then immediately made a face at herself. Zara laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded. "Yes, and I cannot believe you just said that. I cannot believe I said that either. Ignore that entirely. Absolutely not. I'm keeping that." Something loosened between them, the particular stiffness that had been there. Not coldness, but carefulness. The kind that comes from two people paying close attention to each other and knowing it. Eased. They talked the way people talk when they've decided to stop managing the conversation. About music and neighborhoods and the specific grief of watching a city you love change faster than you can hold it. About what Zara's parents had sacrificed so she could build something. About what it had cost Margaret to start over at 50 and what it had, unexpectedly, returned to her. "I want you to notice something about this moment." Nobody said anything grand. Nobody made a declaration. They just showed up. Fully. Without the performance of certainty they didn't have. And sometimes that's the whole thing. That's the entire brave act. Being in the room, honest, without an exit strategy. Sometime during the second set, Zara set her glass down and looked at Margaret in the particular way she had, direct, unhurried, giving the moment its full weight. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me, when I kept you from moving on the train. When I stayed still and didn't say anything." She paused. "I told myself it was just consideration, that I didn't want to wake you. Was it?" "Not entirely, no." Margaret held her gaze. The quartet moved through something slow and aching in the background. "I've been thinking about something too," Margaret said. "I told myself this was impractical, that the timing was wrong, that I was too old for this kind of thing to make sense. And I've decided I've been wrong about what I'm too old for before. I'm open to being wrong again." Zara smiled. The one that changed the whole room, the one Margaret had first registered weeks ago without letting herself register it properly. She reached across the small table and set her hand open, facing up. Margaret looked at it for a moment, at the restaurant around them, the low warm light, the other tables, the music carrying everything along, at the total ordinariness of this night in this city, and at what was being offered inside that ordinariness. She placed her hand in Zara's. The quartet kept playing. The room kept being itself. Nothing outside that table knew or cared what had just shifted. But something had. In the months that followed, it wasn't simple. It isn't supposed to be. Derek needed time. Renee gave them both grace and asked good questions. There were mornings when Margaret woke up, and the old voice came back. The one that catalogued every reason this was impractical, every way it didn't fit the life she'd assumed she'd have, and she had to make the conscious choice, again, not to let that voice be the loudest one. There were differences between them that required patience. 25 years of life between two people means 25 years of different references, different formative experiences, different ways of measuring time and risk, and what counts as a good day. They had conversations that were harder than either expected. There were silences that needed decoding. There were moments when Margaret had to remind herself that young didn't mean shallow, and moments when Zara had to remember that private didn't mean closed. But there were also Sunday mornings at Margaret's kitchen table in Kirkwood, with good coffee and no agenda. Walks through Piedmont Park in the early cool before the heat arrived. Evenings back at Venkman's, because it had become theirs in the way that places become yours when something important happened inside them. There was the night Zara stayed through a storm that knocked the power out, and they sat in the dark and talked for 4 hours straight, and Margaret thought, "I haven't talked like this in years. Maybe ever." And there was the particular, irreplaceable feeling of being seen, Not the resume version, not the professional version, not the version she presented to the world to communicate that she was capable and fine and didn't need anything. The whole version. All 50 years of it, the accomplishments and the fatigue and the things she'd set aside, and the unexpected softness that had survived all the practical years intact. That feeling, Margaret learned, doesn't have an age requirement. It doesn't check your timeline. It doesn't ask whether the circumstances are convenient. It just arrives, in a MARTA car on a Tuesday afternoon, in the form of someone reading your resume while you sleep on their shoulder. And it waits, patient and quiet, for you to be brave enough to let it stay. 8 months after that Tuesday, Margaret got a notification on her phone during a meeting at Meridian. She glanced at it under the table. Running 10 minutes late. Traffic on 85. Save me a seat. They were meeting Renee for dinner. Renee, who had driven up from Nashville specifically because she wanted to. Renee, who had texted Margaret 3 days earlier. I like her, Mom. I just wanted you to know that. Margaret put her phone away, returned to the meeting, did the work she was there to do, and when it was over, she took Marta home. Here's the question I want to leave you with. Is there something you've filed under too late that might not be? Something you decided wasn't for you anymore, without checking recently whether that was still true? Margaret spent years being certain she knew the shape of what remained for her. She was wrong. Beautifully, completely wrong. You might be too. If this story found you at the right time, like it was meant for you specifically, leave a like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe. There's more story here, and every one of them matters.
I didn't expect to say this, but it's true. I know. I feel it too.